The officer's knees slammed down on the Filipino man's chest, pinning him against the cold airport floor. "Stay down." I said stay down. The cop's voice thundered through the terminal, his face red, breath heavy. Chaos erupted around them, gasps, screams, flashing cameras. The Filipino man trembled, his hands shaking, but he wasn't fighting back. Still, the officer pressed harder, fingers tightening around his baton like he was ready to strike again. "Please," the man wheezed, barely a whisper. "I can't breathe." The cop didn't care. Another officer rushed over. "What's going on?" His eyes darted between the scene, his furious partner and the man crushed beneath him. "Tried to run past security," the cop growled. "Probably smuggling something. Had to take him down." But something felt off. The Filipino man wasn't resisting. He wasn't yelling. Just lying there, face twisted in pain. His bag was thrown aside, its contents scattered, a few clothes, a book, a small box, with a child's drawing on it. Then, a little girl's voice pierced the air. "Daddy." The officer froze. The crowd gasped. The Filipino man turned his head just enough to see her, his daughter, sprinting toward him, her tiny face streaked with tears. Behind her, a woman chased after, panic etched across her features. And that's when it happened. The officer's grip on his baton loosened. His face drained of color. He looked from the child to the woman, then back to the man pinned beneath him. And he realized. But it was too late. A few hours earlier, the airport had been calm. Ethan Reyes stepped through the glass doors of LAX, holding his daughter's tiny hand. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, making sure everything was in place. His wife, Emily, walked beside him, passports and tickets in hand. "Excited, sweetheart?" Ethan smiled as Sophie skipped beside him. She giggled. "I can't wait to see Grandma." Ethan's chest tightened with warmth. It had been years since he'd been back to the Philippines. This trip was special, he'd saved for it, planned every detail. His mother had never met Sophie in person. This was going to be a surprise. What he didn't know was that this trip would turn into a nightmare. At the check-in counter, everything was smooth. A friendly airline worker took their passports. Ethan lifted the suitcases onto the belt. Then, something strange. A police officer, standing near security, staring. Ethan shook it off. Maybe just routine. But as they moved forward, the feeling didn't leave. That stare, burning into his back. He glanced over his shoulder. The cop was still watching. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he forced a smile for Sophie. "Stay close to Mommy, okay?" They reached security. He placed his backpack in the bin, kicked off his shoes, removed his belt. Emily did the same with Sophie's tiny backpack. "Step forward," the TSA agent instructed. Ethan stepped through. Beep. He froze. "Step back and try again," the agent said. Again. Beep. People behind him sighed. "I don't have anything on me," Ethan said, confused. The agent barely reacted, nodding toward the side. "Step over here, sir." Emily's eyes filled with worry. Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. "I'll be fine." A second agent patted him down, ran a detector over his body. "Nothing." "You're good," the agent finally said. Ethan exhaled in relief, reached for his bag. A firm hand gripped his shoulder. He turned. The cop. "Sir, I need you to come with me." The voice was sharp, cold. Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Why?" "You were acting suspiciously," the officer said. "You hesitated in line." The scanner kept going off. Ethan frowned. "It wasn't my fault. Your agents just cleared me." The officer didn't let go. "Step aside." Emily rushed over. "What's going on?" The cop barely looked at her. "Ma'am, stay back." "I will not stay back," she snapped. "He hasn't done anything wrong." People started watching. Phones came out. The air in the room shifted. Ethan kept his voice calm. "We have a flight to catch. My family is waiting. If you have a real reason to stop me, fine. But don't put your hands where I can see them," the officer barked. Ethan clenched his jaw. "I'm not a criminal." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Are you refusing?" Ethan took a slow breath. He didn't want to cause trouble. Didn't want to scare Sophie. "No," he said. "I just want to know." Too late. The officer grabbed him. "Wait." Before Ethan could react, he was shoved down. His chest slammed against the floor. A knee pressed into his back. A gasp rippled through the airport. Emily screamed. "Stop." He didn't do anything. The officer reached for his baton. The world spun. People shouted. Phones recorded. And then, "Daddy." Sophie's tiny voice shattered the chaos. The officer froze. A woman screamed. And in that split second, everything changed. Ethan's breath hitched as the officer's grip on him loosened. He turned his head and saw her, a little girl standing just a few feet away, eyes wide with fear, tiny hands clenched into fists. "Daddy." Sophie's voice cracked through the tension like a thunderclap. She tried to run toward him, but Emily yanked her back just in time. "Stay here, baby," Emily's voice trembled. The crowd murmured, phones still recording. Some whispered, others shouted openly. "Get off him. He didn't do anything. He has a kid, for God's sake." But the officer didn't move right away. His face was still twisted in anger, his knee pressing down, making Ethan gasp for air. I can't." That's when the second officer, the one who had rushed over earlier, finally stepped in. "Let him go." His voice was firm. The first officer blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. He looked around, really looked, and suddenly seemed aware of the dozens of eyes locked onto him. Then, slowly, he lifted his knee off Ethan's back and stepped away. Ethan sucked in a deep breath and rolled onto his side, coughing. His ribs ached. His wrists burned where the officer had twisted them. Emily was beside him in an instant, hands on his face. "Are you okay?" "Ethan, talk to me." He nodded weakly. I think so." The second officer bent down, his expression unreadable. "Sir, can you stand?" Ethan swallowed hard, pushing himself up. His legs shook, but he managed. Emily helped him. Sophie clung to her mother's side, her little face buried in Emily's shirt. And then, the first officer finally spoke again. "You tried to run." Ethan turned to him, blood boiling. "I didn't run." The officer crossed his arms. "You looked suspicious." Ethan stared in disbelief. His chest rose and fell, anger coursing through him. "I was walking with my wife and daughter. I followed every rule. And you tackled me like a criminal." The crowd was still watching, tension thick in the air. The second officer sighed. "All right, let's take this somewhere private." Ethan stiffened. "Why?" "Just to clear things up." Emily stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Absolutely not. We're not going anywhere. We're getting on our flight." The second officer kept his tone level. "Ma'am, please. If we don't handle this the right way, it's going to turn into something worse." Emily gritted her teeth. "It's already worse." More voices rose from the crowd. "This is ridiculous. You can't just do that to people." A security supervisor appeared, looking frazzled. "What's going on here?" Before anyone could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Officer Jacobs." Silence. A tall man in a suit stood just beyond the security checkpoint, his expression cold, unreadable. Ethan didn't know who he was, but the way Officer Jacobs stiffened made it clear this man was in charge. Jacobs cleared his throat. "Sir, I was just..." The man held up a hand. "Enough." Then, turning to Ethan, his voice softened slightly. "Mr. Reyes, is it?" Ethan blinked. "Yes." The man nodded. "Come with me. Your family too." Emily held onto Ethan's arm, shaking her head. "No. I don't think so. We just want to leave." The man's gaze softened, just a little. "I understand. But I need to make this right." Ethan met Emily's eyes. She was breathing heavily, fighting back tears. He glanced down at Sophie, still clinging to her mother, before finally exhaling. "Fine," he said. "But I want answers." The man nodded. "And you'll get them." He turned sharply. "Follow me." Ethan, Emily, and Sophie followed, with Jacobs and the second officer trailing behind. The crowd watched as they left, murmurs still spreading through the terminal. Then, just before stepping away, Ethan heard something. A passenger muttering, just loud enough for him to catch. "I swear, this always happens to people like him." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The back room. Ethan's heart pounded as they moved through the airport's back corridors, his ribs still aching where the officer had crushed him. His wrist still burned from being twisted. But more than anything, his mind was spinning. This wasn't just about being tackled. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was about something deeper. Something uglier. Emily's grip on his arm tightened. Sophie, sensing something was wrong, stayed silent, her small hand wrapped around her mother's. Behind them, Officer Jacobs walked stiffly, his jaw clenched. The second officer, the one who had stepped in, kept his expression neutral, but his eyes flickered toward Ethan every few seconds. Finally, they reached a private room, a conference room with a long table. The man in the suit pushed the door open and gestured for them to step inside. "Please. Have a seat." Ethan hesitated. He didn't trust this. But Emily gave him a small nod, so they stepped in. The man shut the door behind them, then sat across the table. Folding his hands together, he spoke calmly. "First," he said, "I want to formally apologize." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The man met his gaze. "My name is Robert Calloway. I oversee security operations for this airport." Ethan's jaw tightened. Calloway exhaled. "And I saw everything." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Emily's voice, sharp with anger, "Then why didn't you stop it?" Calloway didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward Jacobs. Then toward the second officer. Finally, he said it. "I needed to see how far it would go." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You needed to see?" His voice was low, dangerous. "I could barely breathe. My daughter saw me get thrown to the ground like some criminal." From the corner, Jacob scoffed. "You were acting suspicious." And just like that, Ethan realized something. This wasn't just about one cop. This was bigger. And it was far from over. "Enough." Calloway's voice was ice. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Jacobs." Jacobs flinched slightly but snapped his mouth shut. Calloway turned back to Ethan. "You have every right to be furious. What happened out there was unacceptable." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then do something about it." Calloway nodded. "That's exactly why we're here." Emily crossed her arms. "So what now? You give us a half-hearted apology, and we're just supposed to move on?" "No," Calloway said. His voice was firm. "I want the truth." Ethan frowned. "The truth?" Calloway nodded. Why did Jacobs target you? Jacob stiffened. I already told you. Calloway raised a hand, cutting him off. I want to hear it from him. He turned to Ethan, locking eyes. Did you notice anything before the incident? Ethan took a deep breath. Yes. He turned toward Jacobs. He was watching me the moment I stepped into the airport. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Is that true? Jacobs didn't answer. His face was red now, jaw locked tight. Ethan pushed forward. At first, I ignored it. But then I felt it again at security. He was staring at me the entire time. Calloway turned to Jacobs. Do you have an explanation for that? Jacobs hesitated. He was acting nervous. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Nervous? You mean I was with my wife and daughter, excited for our flight? That's nervous to you? Jacobs shifted. You hesitated in line. Your bag looked heavy. You set off the scanner. Calloway sighed. And did you check what set off the scanner? The second officer, the one who had stepped in, finally spoke. Nothing, he said. He was cleared. Jacobs' face twitched. Still. Let's be honest, Jacobs. Calloway cut him off. His voice was sharper now. You assumed something about Mr. Reyes the second you saw him. Jacobs clenched his jaw. Ethan stared at him. And then, finally, Jacob snapped. He looked like a smuggler. Silence. A heavy silence that suffocated the room. Ethan felt Emily stiffen beside him. His fists clenched so tight his nails bit into his palms. Jacobs looked defensive now, his eyes darting between Calloway and Ethan. I've been working security for years. I know the signs. He fit the profile. Ethan's blood ran cold. His stomach twisted. His heart pounded in his ears. What profile? Ethan's voice was dangerously low. Jacobs didn't answer. But he didn't have to. Ethan knew. Emily's voice shook with rage. You mean because he's Filipino? Jacob's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. Calloway leaned back in his chair, eyes dark. So you assumed, without reason, without evidence, that Mr. Reyes was a criminal. Jacob's face burned red. He opened his mouth, but Calloway didn't let him speak. Leave. Jacobs blinked. What? Leave. Calloway's voice was like steel. You're done here. Jacobs turned redder. You can't. I can. Calloway stood up, towering over him. And I just did. Jacobs gritted his teeth, but Calloway's stare didn't waver. Finally, Jacobs turned sharply and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Silence. Then, Calloway exhaled, rubbing his temples. I'll deal with him later. Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand still shaking. Calloway turned to him. Mr. Reyes. I can't undo what happened. Ethan swallowed hard. No. You can't. Calloway nodded. But I can make sure it never happens again. Ethan studied him. He wanted to believe him. But how many times had people in power said those words? How many times had they promised to make it right, only for nothing to change? Emily spoke first. What does that mean? She demanded. Are you just going to suspend him? Give him a slap on the wrist? Calloway hesitated. I can't give details, but I can assure you there will be consequences. Ethan wasn't sure if he believed him. But before he could say anything, a tiny voice spoke. Can we go now? Sophie's voice was shaky. She was tired. Confused. Ethan's chest ached. This was supposed to be a happy trip. A chance to see family. A chance for Sophie to meet her grandmother. Instead, it had turned into this. He looked at Calloway. Are we free to go? Calloway nodded. Yes. You'll make your flight. Ethan didn't thank him. Instead, he took Emily's hand, picked up Sophie, and walked toward the door. Just as he reached it, Calloway spoke one last time. Mr. Reyes. Ethan paused, turned slightly. Calloway's expression was unreadable. I meant what I said. This won't be ignored. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he pushed the door open and walked out. As they headed back toward their gate, something lingered in the air. Something unfinished. This wasn't over. Not yet. And deep in his gut, Ethan knew. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. They just wanted to get to their gate, board the plane, leave this nightmare behind. The boarding area for their flight to Manila was already bustling with passengers. The final call was approaching. Emily exhaled sharply. Let's just get on the plane, she whispered. Ethan nodded. He just wanted to sit down, close his eyes, and breathe. But then, excuse me, sir. Ethan turned sharply. A tall man in a business suit stood nearby. Blonde hair. Sharp blue eyes. Not airport security. Not a cop. But something about him made Ethan's stomach clench. Can I help you? Ethan's voice was weary. The man gave a thin, practiced smile. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. My name is Agent Carter. Ethan's blood ran cold. Emily immediately stepped closer, her hand tightening around his arm. We're about to board our flight. Carter nodded. I understand, ma'am. This won't take long. Ethan clenched his jaw. What is this about? Carter reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge. We just have a few questions regarding the incident earlier. Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. We already spoke to airport security. It was handled. Carter's smile didn't falter. I'm sure it was. But I'd like to hear your side of the story myself. Emily's grip tightened. Sophie stirred slightly in Ethan's arms, her sleepy voice murmuring, Daddy? Ethan swallowed hard. We've been through enough today. We're tired. We just want to go home. Carter didn't move. This won't take long, he repeated. It's just a routine check. Ethan glanced at Emily. He didn't trust this. Not one bit. But what choice did he have? He exhaled sharply. Fine. Ask your questions. Carter's expression didn't change. Let's talk somewhere private. Ethan's stomach twisted. Not again. The room. They were led into another private office. Smaller than the one before. No windows. A single desk. 2 chairs. Something was wrong. Carter gestured for Ethan to sit. Emily hesitated. I'm coming with him. Carter gave a tight smile. I'd prefer to speak with him alone. Emily crossed her arms. Too bad. Carter exhaled but didn't argue. Fine. Ethan sat down, setting Sophie on his lap. She was too tired to ask what was happening. She simply curled into his chest, her small fingers gripping his shirt. Carter took a seat across from them, folding his hands. So, Mr. Reyes, let's get straight to the point. Ethan tensed. What exactly were you carrying in your bag? Ethan's brow furrowed. What? Carter tilted his head slightly. Officer Jacobs seemed convinced you were carrying something suspicious. Ethan's jaw clenched. I wasn't. Carter's stare didn't waver. Are you sure? Ethan's patience snapped. Yes, I'm sure. Unless you think diapers, baby snacks, and a couple of books are a national threat. Carter's gaze was unreadable. Then, he pulled something from his pocket. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A photo. A grainy, black and white surveillance image. Of him. Ethan stared. The picture showed him standing in line at security, his face turned slightly as he spoke to Emily. Carter placed the photo on the table, tapping it once. "We've been keeping an eye on you." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Emily sucked in a sharp breath. "What? Why?" Carter leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Reyes, have you traveled internationally before?" Ethan hesitated. "Not in a long time." Carter nodded slowly, as if considering something. "And what do you do for a living?" Ethan frowned. "I work in IT. Software development." Carter tapped the photo again. "Then tell me why your name showed up in a flagged database." The room went silent. Ethan's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" Carter leaned back, folding his arms. "Your name, Ethan Reyes, is connected to an ongoing investigation. A smuggling ring." Ethan's stomach dropped. "That's insane. I have nothing to do with that." Emily stood up, her voice shaking. "This is harassment. We're leaving." Carter held up a hand. "Sit down, Mrs. Reyes." Emily didn't move. Sophie whimpered slightly, sensing the tension. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've never been involved in anything illegal. Check my records, I've never even had a speeding ticket." Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, he sighed and rubbed his temple. "Look, I'm not saying you're guilty." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Good, because I'm not." But Carter continued. "Your name is connected to something. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it's not. I just need to verify a few things before you leave the country." Ethan's patience snapped. "You have my passport. You have my information. What more do you need?" Carter didn't answer right away. Then, his tone shifted. "Just sit tight." He stood up and walked out, locking the door behind him. Ethan and Emily froze. The sound of the lock clicking into place sent ice through Ethan's veins. Emily rushed to the door and yanked the handle. It didn't budge. Ethan's blood turned to ice. "What the hell is going on?" Emily pounded on the door. "Hey! Open this door!" No response. Sophie whimpered again, gripping Ethan's shirt tighter. "Mommy?" Ethan took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had to stay strong. For Emily. For Sophie. But deep down, fear curled in his stomach. Something was very, very wrong. Ethan stared at the locked door, his breath coming fast. This wasn't over. The nightmare was just beginning. Ethan thought it was finally over. The airport ordeal, the accusations, the stress. All he wanted was to board the plane, take off, and leave this nightmare behind. But then, he saw him. A tall man in a business suit. Short blonde hair. Sharp blue eyes. He wasn't a cop, but something about him made Ethan's stomach churn. "Excuse me, sir." The man's voice was calm, deliberate. Too smooth. Ethan's instincts screamed at him, this wasn't right. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked cautiously. The man gave a thin, professional smile and pulled out a badge. "Agent Carter. Homeland Security." Emily immediately tensed beside him, stepping closer. "We're about to board our flight." Carter nodded. "I understand, ma'am. This won't take long." Ethan clenched his jaw. He already knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. "What's this about?" Carter's eyes didn't waver. "We just need to ask you a few questions regarding the incident earlier." Ethan's pulse pounded. "We already spoke to airport security. It was handled." Carter's smile didn't falter. "I'm sure it was. But I'd like to hear your side of the story myself." Emily's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. The last thing they needed was another delay. "We've been through enough today," Ethan said firmly. "We just want to go home." Carter didn't move. "This won't take long." Ethan and Emily exchanged glances. They both knew they had no real choice. They followed Carter. The arrest. The room was small. No windows. No phone signal. No escape. Carter folded his hands, taking his time before speaking. Then, finally, the words fell from his lips like ice. "Ethan Reyes, you're under arrest." Ethan's breath caught. Emily's face went pale. "What?" The officer behind Ethan grabbed his arms, twisting them back. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. Sophie screamed. Emily lunged toward him, but another officer blocked her. "No! You can't do this!" Ethan struggled, his mind racing. "For what? What am I being arrested for?" Carter's voice was calm, unshaken. "Your name is in a smuggling database." Ethan's world tilted. Smuggling? It had to be a mistake. But Carter wasn't listening. They had already decided he was guilty. Then, the door burst open. A woman in a black suit strode in, heels clicking against the floor. "Agent Lewis." Her voice was sharp. "He's free to go." Carter turned to her, confused. "What?" Lewis pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the table. Clerical error. His name was flagged by mistake. Ethan's pulse pounded as the cuffs were removed. But as he rubbed his sore wrists, he saw the look in Lewis's eyes. She wasn't convinced it was a mistake. "Someone put your name there on purpose," she murmured as she handed him a card. "If anything strange happens, call me." Ethan barely had time to process what she meant. Minutes later, they were on their flight. And then, hell broke loose. The hijacking. At first, it was just a jolt. The plane shuddered. The lights flickered. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Technical difficulties. Emily squeezed Ethan's hand. "It's just turbulence." But Ethan knew. This wasn't turbulence. Then, the voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're taking control of this flight now." A sharp bang. Gunshot. Screams. Hijackers. They stormed the aisle. Faces masked. Guns raised. And they weren't here for money. They weren't here for ransom. They were here for him. A masked man pointed a gun straight at Ethan. "Looks like we found our special passenger." Then, they handed him a phone. A voice crackled on the other end. Cold. Calculated. Familiar. Daniel Mercer. The man behind everything. "I need you to do a job for me, Mr. Reyes." Ethan's stomach dropped. The hijackers forced him to hack into a high-security financial system. A cyber heist. Billions in dirty money. If he refused, Mercer would start killing passengers, starting with Emily. Ethan had no choice. He pretended to comply. But instead of hacking the bank, he hacked the plane. Emergency override. Alarms blared. Distress signal sent. Fighter jets appeared outside. The hijackers panicked. Chaos erupted. Ethan fought back. He took one down. Passengers overpowered the rest. It was over. Or so he thought. Because Mercer was still out there. And he wasn't done. The worst loss. When the plane landed, federal agents swarmed the aircraft. Ethan was pulled aside. "We need to talk." Inside a briefing room, they laid it all out. Mercer had orchestrated the hijacking as a test. He wanted to see if Ethan was capable of breaking through high-security systems. And now? The government wanted Ethan to help take Mercer down. Ethan refused. "I just want to go home." The agent's warning was quiet, almost sympathetic. Mercer doesn't let loose ends go. Then, the door burst open. Emily. Tears in her eyes. Sophie was missing. Ethan's blood turned to ice. A vibration in his pocket. A message. He pulled out his phone. A photo. Sophie. Strapped into an SUV. Terrified. A single line of text. You thought this was over? Think again. Let's talk, Mr. Reyes. Ethan's hands curled into fists. His pulse pounded. His entire body shook with rage. Mercer had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because now, this was war.